is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant.
My family is going through a period of transition as well. King Charles had braced himself for tough choices, betrayals within the family, and even the prospect of being on his own. However, he was unprepared for the sealed decree that was presented to him that morning. It contained one terrible directive and was written under the late Queen's authority. Camilla would not be allowed to live permanently in any royal residence under Crown supervision. Charles's hands stopped moving as he read the last line, and the room fell silent. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. At Buckingham Palace, a royal secretary entered the study with a red dispatch box bearing the Elizabeth cipher stamp. Documents issued under her authority were identified by the cipher, which served as her official royal mark. He placed the box in front of the monarch and clarified that its seal could only be broken following a constitutional review, which looked at whether directives were still in effect following the death of a sovereign. Unaware that the next page would be a blow to his marriage, Charles opened it. Every home under Crown authority, including Sandringham House, Balmoral Castle, Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, and others, was prohibited from being Camilla's permanent abode by the edict. Crown-controlled means that the properties were owned by the monarchy rather than the ruling monarch as private property. After reading the restriction again, Charles took off his spectacles and set them next to the page. There was more to his destruction than just the order. Knowing that her son would eventually realize how little power his love could command, his mother wrote it. Camilla waited close by, anticipating a discussion regarding upcoming household arrangements. She looked at the monarch's face when he came in without the folder and realized that something had happened that could never be undone. "What was decided?" she inquired. He attempted to respond, but the words would not come. The edict was rendered much harsher by a handwritten provision. It could not be overturned in private by any sovereign. A Crown Council had to hear any challenge. Decisions impacting royal authority would be examined by a formal group, and the outcome would be permanently recorded. "Who else knows?" Charles asked. In response, the secretary stated that Prince William and Princess Anne had been appointed guardians in charge of safeguarding the document and making sure its guidelines were adhered to. Anne showed up and asked to meet her brother alone before he could tell the Queen Consort everything. Charles was aware that the decree had only partially disclosed the truth, and she carried a second sealed envelope with their mother's handwriting on it. However, the edict had done more than just keep Camilla out of the royal homes. Charles was forced to choose between the family members who had vowed to uphold his mother's last order and the lady he loved. This was more than just a disagreement over lodgings, keys, or ceremonial privilege for Charles. The order affected the most intimate aspect of his life. After decades of inspection, he thought he had finally secured the future. The order meant something even colder to Camilla. In public, she might stay by the king's side. However, the late queen had made sure that she would never be completely acknowledged as a member of the oldest royal walls. Every regal hallway was filled with memories that Charles carried. Windsor carried the load of his upbringing, his parents, and the protracted period during which succession seemed less like a promise and more like a burden. Balmoral had a deeper secret. Summers spent in silence with family, challenging talks, and the last vestiges of a mother whose power persisted after death. These were more than just opulent homes. The proclamation felt like a personal judgment etched into the walls themselves, because these were the locations where the monarch's identity had been developed. Camilla realized that more than just a title had always determined her status. Although the reigning monarch's wife was the queen consort, this title did not automatically confer permanent or personal ownership rights over royal property. His allegiance and the institution's cautious approval had shielded her acceptance, which had come gradually. That safeguard looked unexpectedly brittle now that there was only one paper. In the quiet sitting area, Camilla gave him a sharp glance. "Which houses?" she inquired. Charles was unable to respond right away. He went to the window, collected himself, and carefully listed them. Sandringham, Balmoral, Windsor Castle, and Buckingham Palace. Every name fell like a distinct defeat. He could tell she comprehended the truth before he had to explain it, since she stayed motionless and listened until the last resident had been spoken. This was not a short-term agreement. It was an enduring barrier. Camilla refrained from crying. She took a palace key out of her purse and set it on the table between them. She then inquired as to whether the others needed to be turned over before dusk. Charles was broken by the question because it was calm, pragmatic, and much more agonizing than rage. Anne had a different opinion on the decree. The Princess Royal thought it shielded crown property against rival claims following her brother's reign, potential inheritance issues, and personal allegiance. She didn't see the order as punishment. It served as a barrier to prevent confusion. William had no such assurance. He acknowledged that enforcing the contract might emotionally ruin his father in a private discussion with Catherine. However, the prince also concerned that disobeying his grandmother's order would erode confidence in the crown, the establishment that kept national obligations apart from personal preferences. Then Catherine saw that the decree had a single line. The Windsor incident was mentioned in a short handwritten note as the event that necessitated the restriction. The family would have to face the private Windsor incident that they had spent years without naming in order to comprehend why Elizabeth had taken such a drastic measure. Neither vague imperial disapproval nor distant suspicion had given rise to the proclamation. It all started on a private evening at Windsor Castle when a seemingly routine conversation turned into a dead end. There were just 4 attendees, no formal minutes were taken, and the doors were kept locked. However, by dawn, the late Queen had called her confidential secretary and started writing the decree that would eventually destroy her oldest son. Following a family memorial ceremony, Queen Elizabeth had called Charles, Camilla, and Anne into her own drawing room. The night was still clouded by grief, and none of them anticipated that a useful conversation would turn into a long-lasting rift. The monarch wanted to know exactly what would happen to royal homes after she passed away. Crown properties were not personal estates that a king or queen might freely transfer to a spouse, but rather residences held for the institution. Before posing the question that altered the atmosphere, Camilla listened intently. If she survived her husband, she wanted to know if she would continue to have access to Balmoral and a permanent private suite at Windsor. The Queen's face instantly stiffened. The request didn't sound secure to her. It sounded like a claim that would extend into the following reign and beyond Charles's lifespan. Charles took swift action to protect his spouse. Denying her long-term protection, he claimed, would embarrass her and rekindle wounds the family had worked for years to heal. The monarch thought he was protecting honor. Elizabeth overheard an attempt to transform personal hardship into an enduring entitlement. Anne saw the disagreement intensify. The Princess Royal had anticipated a thoughtful family conversation, but as devotion and property became mixed up, she noticed her mother's tone shift. Charles applied more pressure. Camilla maintained her composure. But with each second that went by, the quiet surrounding her query became more intense. The pivotal time then arrived. A planned household memorandum was set on the table by Camilla. A formal written plan outlining future arrangements was called a memorandum. Additionally, Windsor, Balmoral, and other homes were listed for her ongoing personal usage. After reading the page, Elizabeth pushed it back and closed it without signing. The properties owned by the Crown, she argued, could never make up for the pain of the past. Although there was no agreement at the end of the conference, the harm had already been done. Later that evening, the Queen summoned her private secretary and issued a formal directive to draft a legally binding order prohibiting Camilla from residing permanently in properties under Crown authority. Anne saw the command. William was thereafter designated as the custodian, who would be in charge of safeguarding it following succession. Anne now held the second envelope that included her mother's personal justification to Charles. Windsor had always been the point of no return, and their words could either ease the pain or demonstrate that. The long-forgotten dispute at Windsor was forgotten when Anne eventually presented their mother's letter to Charles. It turned into a conflict between the living. Before Anne broke the seal, Charles dismissed all of the room's assistants. There were no quarters left to soften the language. Neither sibling was shielded from what followed by any ceremonial formality, or administrators prepared to reroute the subject. The king requested an explanation for his sister's silent guardianship of the decree. Anne responded just as forcefully. She hadn't kept it hidden from him. She had protected their mother's last authority.